Hey everybody, welcome back to Cultural Clashes, the show where we discuss random topics and we pretend that we know what we're talking about the whole time. I'm Alex, and this is my co-host Christy.
Hi.
And we're gonna just jump right into it. But first, make sure that you like and subscribe if you'd like to see more content from us. Thank you.
Okay, so we're gonna go ahead and pull our topics out of the box.
Yes, the magical box.
Mix them up so the most recents don't have a preference.
Yeah. So what we do here is we, throughout the week, when we find a topic or an idea that pops into our mind, we'll write it down on a piece of note paper, and we'll put it into the box for discussion later. Neither of us know what the previous one has actually wrote, so it's generally a surprise for both of us.
Okay, first one, policy versus culture.
Policy versus culture, nice. I'll pull out the next one. Telework.
Oh, nice.
That's very apt.
That's really funny. I thought to put telework in, but I hadn't. It's one of those ideas I thought of, and then I forgot to put in, and then I forgot what it was. And so I'm glad I didn't, because we would have had two teleworks.
Just like a person on a telework call. I was just about to say that.
I had that in my mind also. I swear.
What do we have here?
Okay, the forces of space.
Okay. So this next part, we go through and we rank whether or not we love the idea, we hate the idea, or we would rather just kill the idea altogether. So I think since you pulled the first one, go ahead and rank what your thoughts are for it first.
I think I'm going to go hate with policy versus culture.
Policy versus culture, hate, huh? All right, I think I'll go with love. I feel like this is always a good topic. With policy versus culture, you can always go down any number of rabbit holes. So I'll do love.
Okay. I would love to talk about telework because I've been doing a lot of that lately.
Well, you know what? I would kill telework because I love teleworking, but I'm over inundated with the concept of telework right now. I am completely COVIDed out of it. So.
Okay, the forces of space, that leaves a kill for the forces of space.
For you? So
yeah,
you kill forces of space? All right, well, I will hate the forces of space because they are seemingly throwing us around through the cosmos at a whim, and I don't appreciate that. So, all right, so next we're going to roll a 6-sided die divided by 2, and whatever number we land on, divided by 2, will be the topic we talk about.
Do you want to roll?
No.
Okay.
All right, 5. 5 divided by 2 rounded up is 3. So it looks like we're talking about the forces of space.
Okay.
All right, let's do it. So I do believe that this one was mine. So yeah. I'll kick it off if you don't mind. The forces of space. There's a bunch of things we could talk about here, but the thing I think I'll start off with is the obvious one, which is Space Force.
Oh, okay, cool.
So
that wasn't obvious to me at all.
She's like, physics? We're talking about physics now? So Space Force, I think, is an interesting concept and idea. I think I remember when the idea of Space Force was first being rolled out, all of the service chiefs were extremely against it and thought that it was a ridiculous idea. But since different chiefs have changed their minds, since the Air Force chief has said that after talking to a lot of his airmen and individuals that were coming up through like the Air Force Academy and boot camp and all sorts of stuff like that, he says that the number one thing that they were voting was that they needed a separate branch in order to do what we do in space right now. So
originally Space Force, I mean, there was no Space Force, but space was part of the Air Force, right?
Yeah, just like the Air Force used to be a part of the Army. So I firmly believe that a lot of the antagonism against it is, of course, due to, one, the politics around it, but two, because any more services that you have, the more that the resources are split up across them. So that's less money for the Air Force, so it's less money for different service branches which are contributing personnel to the Air Force. And I do think there is a legitimate argument to be had where one of these service branch heads had said that they're concerned that a service that is so small with such a smaller portfolio and umbrella wouldn't be able to compete with the larger services in order to get resources. They, for instance, had stated, how is a service smaller than the Coast Guard going to be able to compete against the larger services?
So why is it so small? Why is it smaller than the Coast Guard? Is that because of some upper limit on the how large it can get, or is that just because it's just starting out?
I think it's just because it's just starting out and its current portfolio is pretty small. So, you know, when you hear
when
about...
When you say portfolio, what do you mean by that?
So, yeah, when I say portfolio, I mean the jobs that it's given to have purview over are not very wide-ranging. You know, when you hear Space Force, you think, okay, we're sending Marines into space to kill aliens, you know? But in reality, all that Space Force is really working on right now is, you know, how do we clean up space junk around the planet? You know, how do we... You know, what are some entry beginning level ways we can combat the militarization of space from other countries, and then probably promote militarization of space on our end? So like the amount of jobs that they have to do is a lot more limited. Whereas the Air Force, you know, you're in control of the entire planet's air, right? Like that's what you're doing, you know. It's the whole joke, you know, the Air Force is the first largest Air Force on the world, and the second largest is the Navy, you know, because they have to work together, and you've got a whole planet's domain that you're working on. And right now with space, our level of accessibility for space is so low that it's not like you're shooting, you know, astronauts or Marines or whatever into space all the time. I don't even think you're sending any military personnel with weaponry into space. But it's very interesting to see that, you know, I think that we've had a little bit of a pullback on the antagonism against Space Force because we saw, was it the Russians, I think it was, who tested the satellite killing weapon in space? Or was it the Chinese?
No, I'm not up to date.
So please correct me if I'm wrong, make a mention in the comments, but one of our primary adversaries had recently been detected of testing a satellite killing weapon, basically using projectiles to slam into, you know, either satellite infrastructure or other things we have in space to take them out of orbit. So like that's a big issue, especially since we've all signed an agreement that we're not going to be fighting in space. So, which, as we can tell by international agreements, how well those typically get followed and how those go. So, but yeah, that's like one of the big spiels I had about like some of the concept of Space Forces. But instead of me droning on forever, what are some of your thoughts on the idea of Space Force?
Space Force. Well, okay. Yeah, I think that Space Force as a concept is kind of exciting. It's an interesting domain. I think that that's interesting to hear that their portfolio is kind of small at the moment. It makes sense. But I do think that they probably have a potential for a lot more, barring technological limitations that we might have right now, but which might be reduced in the future. I mean, I kind of think of, so I don't know anything about when exactly the Air Force was formed. It's interesting that it came out of the Army, but I guess depending on when it was formed, which you might know better about, but...
I think around the 50s, I think.
Okay,
Please correct me if I'm wrong. I haven't looked up the exact date in a long time, but it's
the internet will tell you. I imagine that there was probably much less capability existing at that time for actual air warfare than there is now, right? So it does seem like it's smart to actually... Well, it does seem that having some type of military force dedicated to an area is only going to help in terms of technologically advancing it and making it more interesting, both politically. You know, if you have a whole branch that's dedicated to that, like you said, rather than just a subsidiary of the Air Force, which already has all its own things it's doing, there's probably going to be a lot more interest. There's going to be a lot more kind of sway that's going to have towards a certain direction.
I think so too, especially since, you know, people used to love NASA 60 years ago, but what are we doing for NASA now? Half the time it's usually not getting funded, whereas we already know that the DoD budget is usually huge. There's a lot of money to go around there. So I think you're going to have more sustained interest in funding that service if it is, you know, if it continues to move forward, if it's not dismantled. But like, I think you're going to have more sustained interest in that. And it's also important to remember too, with like military branches and services, that like their job isn't just really to like engage in warfare. In fact, kinetic warfare is like one of the smaller jobs and tasks that the military conducts in. That's why like thinking like cleaning up of space junk is a good example of another thing, that we do. Or that the Space Force is supposed to do. That's not really meant to be, shooting lasers to orbit to fire down on enemy targets, which is, I think, the general conception. And I think also like you see that too with, the Navy, the Air Force, the Army. A lot of the things they do are either health related. They're providing services to people around the world. They're providing trainers for other countries to be able to have like better doctors and so on. So usually like, and maybe you don't believe that like that should be the military's purview, and that's a completely legitimate argument. But the way that we've got it set up right now is they do drive a lot of technological innovation because they're in so many different arenas. So I think that you're right, is we may see better technological growth for space capability by having a service dedicated to it than we've seen so far, because NASA's been gutted over the past several years to the point where I think it's been like for the past 20 years almost, we've been writing our astronauts up on Russian rockets because we decommissioned all of ours. And now we're relying on private companies and industries, which, depending on what you believe, that's either a great thing or a horrible thing, because it takes it out of the hands of the people, but either way, it's not coming from the institution that took us to the moon. It's not coming from the institution that like had all the Apollo missions or, any of that. Like it's coming from private companies, and you're having so many private companies have the capability to shoot satellites and everything into the sky that I think at this point now you're regularly seeing liftoffs, weekly almost.
Didn't SpaceX just bring down a couple astronauts recently, the last weekend or something?
Yeah, they did. Yeah.
Related to that, I mean, I think another, talking about the forces of space in general, I think privatization is a huge topic. So I mean, I'll just give my own view on it. I think that there have been many things that the government's kind of initially innovated in or developed, right? The internet, I guess, being one of them, in which then turned over to the
Siri
public.
Siri's another one, yeah.
Public/private sector. Oh, Siri, I didn't know Siri. That's interesting. So how does Apple have Siri specifically?
Because most of these companies basically.
So it's not Siri, but the technology behind Siri, maybe?
Yes.
Okay. So kind of just like there's not only Siri, other companies also have the technology that you can then work with.
Yeah, most technology that's funded by the Defense Department isn't actually kept and maintained solely by the Defense Department. It's funded in concert with the services and individual companies, and usually these companies have proprietary rights to some of this, unless they're like being done on grants, which can only be released to the public. So basically they're usually done in concert with these private companies.
Okay. So I think that's so as far as space goes, to me it seems like it's another one of these areas in which, yes, the government initially funded, right? And by some arguments, I think an argument I agree with as well, that's what the government's for, is to kind of invest a large amount of money initially in pursuits that seem very hard to succeed in, that the public doesn't really have an appetite, or the private sector doesn't really have an appetite for. That's what I'm kind of using as my public. The private sector doesn't really have an appetite for because it's not profitable. So then the public sector, through the government, ends up funding these things. And then eventually they become an area that actually the private sector can pick up from there. And that seems, I guess we could debate it, but it seems mostly like it could be a positive thing if you have.
Well, renewable energy is one of those that was picked up in the past 10 years, like based upon, like we were already making advances in it, but streamlining advances for solar paneling and other types of, geothermal energy is stuff that was also, subsidies by the government and additional funding to those industries helps improve research. And that's in a way that's not a direct collaboration. That's more just how the government helps and shape what society or what, the government in the name of society is deeming as like what we want to do next. So I think there's a big point to be had that like the Chinese are already pushing forth into space a lot. They're already working on the best way to commercialize different resources in space. India has been pushing a lot into space as well. The Russians have also already been there. So a lot of other
Pakistan just did something recently as well.
Yeah, Pakistan as well. So like it's not a place that is American dominated anymore, and or Russian dominated. If you know the history, the Russians pretty much beat us to every single marker of firsts in space except the moon, and then we declared victory and went on from there. So like, but it's not just a game for superpowers anymore. It's a game for everybody. So
yeah. So in that sense, it might be helpful to have more of everybody involved in the terms of private companies as well. It's less nationalized and more free market competition.
Yeah. So yeah, that's one thing I think is pretty interesting as well. I'm interested to see how it goes. Whether or not you agree with the administration that kind of pushed it forward, this is something that I think we'll really have to see. We'll really have to judge what the merits of this service and what they do going forward is on whether we want to keep it, because they've already thrown it into the public world, and something like this is pretty hard to re-put back into the fold. And the Army made the same protests about the Air Force when they first came out. They said, no, we can handle this. We already have the people for it. We have the infrastructure. We have everything we need to do this. And now the Air Force is one of the most technologically advanced branches, competing, of course, with the Navy. So like, it's at first, it could be a bad idea, but it's really what you do with it, I guess, at this point, since it's already done. So that's kind of my thoughts. I'm interested to see, what do you think? What are your thoughts on commercialization of like space, like asteroid mining or lunar mining?
I don't know. I think it's interesting. I think that I think there's a lot of potential room for complications with those kinds of things. It depends, right? So, for instance, who are the companies who get involved? Assumedly, I would assume, especially the direction that we're going, that there will be private companies who are capitalizing on this, not government or military branches. So then, a question comes up, okay, so who has jurisdiction over workers' rights on the moon? Is that OSHA, or is that something entirely different, especially if you get into the area, which I think is an area which has a lot of potential, which is you have like multinational, consortiums
like the ISS,
together.
Like that's government.
Yes, but a private version of that, working on the moon,
scary.
Right?
Yeah.
So what if you have that, a collaboration between SpaceX and I don't know, China's. Well, maybe not China.
Or Bezos' private company.
Right, but those are both American, right? So I'm thinking, what if you have a multinational collaboration? Then who's governing the rights of those workers working up there? And it's also very far. It's very hard to see. I mean, we already have a lot of like violation of human rights in different labor sectors. I think that's a huge vulnerability to have that on the moon, right? There's a huge potential for huge exploitation of people, basically. On the moon, it's so far away. Do you actually have reporters, journalists investigating it? What if the only way to get to the moon is through those companies, right? Then are you going to have, what kind of transparency will you have?
And you're not allowed to have, like right now, governments can't own plots of land. So that means that, like in the thing that you kind of put forward there, even if it's all American companies going up there and setting up their own private cities or work camps or whatever it is, they're not necessarily governed by American laws,
Yeah.
And then we get into an issue too where, corporations running and making the rules up in space is a fear, but that's really a fear for much more like capitalist leaning societies where you've got, companies like coming out of China, which are doing really well, that by Chinese law are all subject to some extent, the Chinese government's use of their data and information and direction towards like Chinese strategic goals. So, maybe in space you'll have workers that are from American companies that are being solely under the purview of the companies that are going up there, whereas you might have like, You know, and I'm only using the Chinese primarily because they're the ones that I think that have the best chance of getting up there. Not because I've got any issue with the Chinese in general, but like I think that the Chinese companies, like they may be working more in concert and more in tandem with their government and the interests of their government, whereas American companies have a tendency to sometimes do that, but to also sometimes pursue, but they have the capability to pursue their own goals to a much higher level.
Okay, so you're talking about kind of like nationalistic implications, national implications that it could have even if it's completely private sector that's capitalizing on.
Well, not even just national, but like purview of like workers' rights. Like the Chinese have been pretty bad on workers' rights, you know, Russians as well too, but the Americans can be as well. But the Americans, you know, we typically fight back by passing laws that we sometimes do or do not enforce, but by passing laws and then forcing companies to follow those rules. But if we're adhering to treaties that say that, you know, nobody owns space or sections of space, then is it just those companies that get to make their own rules? So you, like American company workers, may not be regulated by OSHA because it could be whatever standard the company's there. Whereas the Chinese government or the Russians or, you know, anybody else may still force their companies to adhere to the rules that they have in place in their own company, or even in a more scary likelihood, say these rules do not apply to you here because it's a different sector. So then standards are even worse for those workers. Yeah. So it could go either way.
Yeah, I think it'd be interesting. I think that the main issue I see is that even so, like U.S. companies, you know, in foreign countries have done their share of not basically dehumanizing workers in different ways, and that's, I think, related to a lack of transparency. Right? Well, it's way over there. You're in China. You're in India. Who knows what you're doing? And how much more likely is that? Yeah, they're already subject to that nation's rules. Yes. Yeah. But like, how much more likely is that on the moon, where you're that much further from any American public to be scandalized by whatever's happening? And you know, how long are people going to be going up for? Is it going to be for a couple years? You know, that's a long time. So
especially since we don't know all of the negative ramifications for being in space in the long term, but we do know stuff like your eyeballs get squinched, you know, down a little bit. You have like some eye retinal damage issues. You could have radiation exposure issues, and you know, we care about our astronauts going up there, but you know, those are people that unfairly have been deemed as more important than other people or high investment, so you need to protect them a lot more than, say, your lunar miner, you know, that you're going up there. Yeah, it's a very
small group, right? It's also a very small group. They're highly specialized. You're sending them up there for a certain period of time. Most of them are scientists, you know, and they're like you said, they've been highly invested in, right? So that's a different kind of area, and they're basically government employees, right?
Yeah.
As opposed to being private sector workers. You know, if we're doing something like mining, you know, miners, we already have not a great track record with health and safety with miners on our
and
in this country.
At best, they'll be contractors to like government services, which even then, contractors usually don't have the same sort of protections as like a government employee or a service member.
Yeah.
So like they may be, okay, well, there are certain rules we have for all personnel that work for our organization up there, but if you're a contractor, you have to follow the rules and regulations of your contracting company. So like it's already a double standard.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I'd be interested to see. I think that I don't know how long that will take to take off as a concept, or I mean, in practice it's already taking off, I think, as a concept, but in practice I don't know how long that will take. I think that will definitely come into play before we ever colonize Mars. I think Mars colonization is almost it's a lot further off than I think any estimated plans. And at least several decades, right? Whether they're talking about Mars not 2020. That's what I was about to say. Mars 2040. I don't know I don't know what that is now.
It changes every couple of years.
Yeah, like I swear it was Mars 20 something.
I think there was a 2024 that was also one, but there's also a 2020. It's because they do like they're multi-years, multi-decade plans sometimes, and then you can just pick a year at any point during, like, when you expect one phase to be completed, and that's what you're saying it is,
Yeah, I swear there was something, must have maybe...
I mean, there's supposed to be a lunar base in 2028, or at least they're going to start pushing towards a lunar base, so
Yeah, so I do think a lunar base and, like, some type of lunar activity is definitely necessary before we're going to Mars,
So... Switching gears a little bit, another thing I think that they're going to work, like the Space Force is supposed to do, is to assist in the various different organizations that help do planetary defense against asteroids. So that's something that's really good. We've gotten really good at tracking incoming asteroids and meteorites that, well, usually it's asteroids, but meteors that like are coming close to the planet. So part of, I think, their purview would be assisting in if we ever needed to, altering or deterring the course of something that could cause massive damage on the planet. So that's an interesting concept. Also scary.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think it's interesting that I think that there's a lot of like views of kind of space domination that, at least in my opinion, like seem to rely on the idea of like us getting our shit together here on Earth first, like maybe as like a global human
unit,
human governance or something like that, like a more global unity before we actually I mean, maybe I'm wrong, but isn't like Star Trek, like all those kind of concepts like built on that?
Some of them definitely are.
Okay. So it's interesting that like, well, we could actually be doing things on kind of a galaxy or, well, solar system level, like protecting the planet from, incoming debris, interplanetary debris before we actually do that. That's interesting to me.
Yeah. Well, I think we'll probably end up maybe more like The Expanse, where, Earth is unified, but that's Earth versus those that settled on Mars versus those that settled in the outer planetary rings.
Oh, interesting.
So some might argue that it's human nature to create cleavages and differences across each other.
Yeah, that would be interesting to see if you had like a colony on Mars, right? Like how long, like, or even the moon, to be honest, right? Like if you had especially if you end up with a privatized group who are not related to the government or any of the military branches, not under that direction. How long until that group on the moon is like, we're fighting for independence now.
Right.
I mean, that's kind of everywhere where you've had major colonial...
They pull in America.
Yeah.
Like, okay,
well,
Britain, like, you're going to have to travel a long way to come here and fight us, so...
Yeah, and in this case, it'll be talking back to the
Earth,
U.S., right?
Well, yeah.
Or U.S. and China. Like, well, no, we were your colonies originally, but now we're doing our own thing. And if you want, we can trade with you.
Yeah, right. We'll trade. We'll become quick friends.
That would be interesting.
All right. Well, maybe let's wrap some things up. We need to re-rate them. I think we put them already back in the box, but the 3 topics were policy / culture, then telework, and then the forces of space. So how do you feel about policy and culture?
I think I'm going to keep I think I had hate on it.
Yeah.
I think I'm going to keep my hate on it.
Gonna hate it? All right. I think I had a love originally, but I think I will go ahead and conform to yours and put hate.
I think actually that like I also, well...
For telework?
I think I would kill the telework, yeah. I think when you said that you've like, been teleworking a lot, so maybe not. Maybe I would have a lot of hate to give it, but maybe I wouldn't love talking about it. But yeah, I think that this was a good topic.
Yeah, I'd kill telework as well, and then I think I would change the forces of space to love. I love how we kind of veered in and out of the different topics there, so I think that's how I feel as well.
Yeah, that's interesting. I didn't know what we were... I did not see the Space Force as the forces of space, which I should have, but...
Well, I like to, keep it open. That way the conversation can go how it needs. Well, yeah, I think this was a really good conversation. Thank you all for joining us today, and make sure that you leave your comments and thoughts on the ideas of either Space Force or, lunar or Martian colonization down in the comments.
Privatization of space.
Privatization of space. And make sure that you hit that like and that subscribe button if you liked our show today. Thanks again.
Thanks for joining.